Hello, everybody. My name is Eric Trexler. You may know me as one of the co-hosts of Iron Culture. You may know me as one of the co-hosts of Mass Office Hours. And tonight, for the first time ever, I'm actually both of those things. This is a kind of simultaneous episode. This episode is, for the people live on YouTube, just a regular old episode of Mass Office Hours, but this is going to be hosted across both platforms. So this is going to be an upcoming episode of the Iron Culture podcast. So if you are listening through the Iron Culture platform, welcome to Office Hours. We hope you enjoy it. If you're part of the Mass Office Hours crowd, then like I said, this is business as usual tonight. But if you're on the Iron Culture side and you're new to this whole thing, a little bit of an introduction I think would be helpful. So it's very possible that you've been listening to Iron Culture for a while and you thought, hey, it'd be pretty cool to get more evidence-based fitness content every week. And you might have also felt like, hey, it'd be great to have that delivered in a live format on YouTube so you can actually participate. So you can ask me questions live in real time. You can ask Dr. Helms of Iron Culture questions live in real time. And if we wanted to make things even better than that, we would then post those live episodes to all the podcast platforms that you love so you can enjoy the replay whenever it suits you. So Mass Office Hours accomplishes all of that, but it's even better because it's not just me and Helms. Every Wednesday night we go live. It's 2 or more members of the Mass Research Review team. We call it Office Hours. That's borrowing from the concept. I don't know if this is globally practiced, but in academia in America, office hours is basically a set time where a professor is going to be in their office. They prop the door open. If you want to come by and chat, ask some questions about class, that's what office hours is for. So we're borrowing on that concept, and we basically show up Wednesday night, 7 p.m. Eastern time, and we say, hey, what do you got? What kind of questions are we talking about? So we answer questions. Mostly the show is a Q&A format, but we also cover topics that we feel like covering sometimes. If we just got something to say, we won't hesitate to say it, cover a current event, cover a recent paper that got published, that kind of thing. So if you like Iron Culture, I think you might like this as well. So give it a shot, see if you like it. And if you do, make sure that you subscribe. You can get Office Hours wherever you get Iron Culture. So we're on YouTube. That's where we're live. The replay stays up forever. And then we also post episodes audio only to a bunch of podcasting platforms. So like I said, if that sounds interesting to you and you're not yet subscribed to Office Hours, make sure you subscribe on YouTube and your favorite podcast platform. If you're part of the Office Hours crew, you're a regular, be sure to like, rate, and subscribe as always. Tell a friend, spread the word. And if you want to submit a question for a future episode, that link is in the description of this episode. Of course, the best way to consume this content, the best way to participate is to join us live on YouTube Wednesday nights. That's enough from me. I want to introduce the good Dr. Mike Zourdos. He is my co-host tonight. Mike, how are we doing?
I'm doing great. Looking forward to my U8 soccer team starting the first round of the playoffs this Saturday. It's big stuff. I'm sure we're going to be getting some press conference requests afterwards. I've informed the kids to say that they owe their success to coaching. Mostly, it's really their coach. It's not the players. It's not the kids. It's not their teammates. It's not their parents working hard to bring them. It's their coach.
Yeah,
it's their coach. They should really give me all the credit. So big stuff. Excited for that. That's mostly what's going on in my life right now.
Well, it's hard to win if you don't have the right lineup and if the athletes aren't in the right place to capitalize on opportunities, and that comes down to good coaching. Also, I'd prefer if you didn't call them kids at this point. If you're playing a sport, you're an athlete. I don't care if you're 5. I don't care if you're 25. I don't care if you're 85. Once you step on the gridiron, you're an athlete regardless of age. So I think as a coach, it's important to kind of reinforce that and say, you're just a player. I don't really care about you. I don't care where you come from. And once you're not useful to me, I'm getting you out of there and I'll replace you because you are a replaceable person.
They are. It's frustrating sometimes. They get tired during practice and they're like, Coach, can I get some water? I said, water? I said, you tied last game. You water.
Yeah.
It's unacceptable.
And then they're puking and then they want more water. And you say, why are you puking if you need so much water? You know?
Yeah, that's when you just send them home.
Yeah.
Send them home. I said, it's a 9-on-9 league. I said, I'd rather play with 8. Get out of here.
Yeah, I mean, that seems fair. So, Mike, We need to get in some fitness content. I know our office hours regulars are dying for it, and I know our new friends from the Iron Culture crowd are interested to see what we got here. So, Mike, this is not a specific question from a specific listener, but it is a genre of question that we get all the time, and that is on the topic of individualizing training. I think this is probably the most frequently discussed topic in the fitness world because it's confusing, right? Like our tiny little brains, we think, okay, here's a training program. It should, introduce a training stimulus, and then a human being should respond to it. And once we start to see different people responding differently to the same programming, we go, wait a minute, what's going on here? How do we explain this? So individualizing training and the variability we see from person to person, it's fascinating. It's something that really confounds us when we see extreme examples of it. So, on the topic of individualization, we talk about the variability that we see from person to person. And then obviously the kind of holy grail for training is how do we predict how different people are going to respond to a particular training program so that we can really individualize and optimize their training prescriptions. So Mike, that's my intro. I'm going to hand it over to you, and I'm going to sit back and enjoy.
Well, this is not only a big topic, but perhaps the biggest topic. I've said in Mass, I think I've said 2 times before that, quote, individualization is the most pressing question we face in the exercise science resistance training related literature today. And I mean that very sincerely because we can do studies over and over again to no end that are comparing 2 different groups in training program A versus training program B. But realistically, we know these are underpowered, and to get a good powered study, it's going to have to carry out for a long time, and it's a longer discussion as of why, but there's a lot of limitations when getting these individuals into the lab. And no matter how much of that we do, it's only going to reveal so much to us, and we're going to see responses that are low to some programs and responses that are really, really high to the same program. So with that said, there's really 4 things that I want to highlight here on individualization. And the first one is, in a moment, I want to demonstrate essentially that it exists. I want to throw some numbers at you and say, hey, here are some of the ranges of responses that I've seen in the literature. So demonstrate that it exists. Now, talk about how we can possibly examine it better in the research, discuss how we're currently dealing with it in practice, and then discuss how we might be able to predict it. So show that it exists, talk about how we can do it better in the research, how we currently deal with it in practice, and how to predict it. So demonstrating that it exists. Again, I want to throw some numbers at you. So imagine I'm in a political debate and I'm throwing a lot of numbers at you. You can't really fact check me in real time. Doesn't matter. They're numbers. They sound great. Vote for me, right? And so with that, think about all of these different long-term outcomes. We have strength and hypertrophy being the 2 most prominent. 2005 study from Hubel et al. 585 people, 12 weeks. Strength gains range from 0% to plus 250% over those 12 weeks in these individuals. Now, this was the same training program that they're going through. Now, I know that's a large range, 0 to 250%. These weren't individuals like most people listening to Mass Office Hours that probably lift very, very regularly, because you're not going to see a 250% increase in strength in 12 weeks. So they were mostly untrained individuals. But nonetheless, that's a huge range. For hypertrophy, they saw changes between negative 2.5% and 59.3%. Now, this isn't relegated to just studies that kind of are a bit more things we're not familiar with and so forth. In our lab specifically, every single study we've ever done, we see this range. So I'm going to take some data from my former student and now research scientist with the Navy diving unit, Alex Klemp. And on squat 1RM over 8 weeks, he saw changes of negative 3% and plus 18.6%. The average was 9.4%, but that's not accounting for the 18 or the negative 3%. Changes in cross-sectional area, get ready for this, negative 9% to plus 48.1%. Now, the mean change there was 13%. And this is not atypical. This absolutely exists. And it doesn't extend to just these long-term outcomes. So another one, and I'm going to get back to this example later, is reps performed, right? Another study we did saw at 70% of 1RM, women and men did squats to failure for one set. There was a range of 6 to 28 reps performed at 70% of one rep, an average of 14. And so this variability exists, and it can be very, very large. And so one thing I want to get across before moving on to point 2 here, which is how we can examine it better in the literature, is that I think this might explain in part why there can be such polarizing opinions sometimes. So over the last year, perhaps thanks to our lab, specifically thanks to my student, Zach Robinson, there's been a lot of debate of training to failure, proximity to failure. And you'll see people get really kind of beholden to their viewpoint on if they should train to failure or not train to failure. And I think part of that is because they both work. And perhaps training to failure is better for some people. Perhaps not training to failure is better for some people. And it makes me think also that, different mechanisms where we think about muscular tension, we think about metabolic stress. It's possible that metabolic stress could be more of a factor for hypertrophy than some folks than for other folks. There was a study from Angleri et al. That looked at drop sets, traditional sets, and pyramid training and found that some folks increased muscle size more with drop sets, some more with traditional sets. Perhaps some benefit from this mechanism more than another. Perhaps it's just practical. We don't know why. But this exists, and this could be the reason why we see such polarizing camps, because various methods do work, right? And could work for people based upon different things there. Love that. I felt like I really earned that.
Yeah, I think for those who are watching on YouTube, I think Skype introduced some things where if you do certain gestures, it will do like animated graphics. And so Mike, when he was really hitting the climax of that crescendo, there were fireworks going off where his face had been. So if you're on YouTube right now, you're getting the full multimedia experience.
So I don't know what gesture I did, but I'm going to keep flailing around over here and see if I can recreate it and how many times I can recreate it. So I'm gonna make sure to make some wild gestures. So we've demonstrated now that it exists. The second point I want to make is how we can examine it better in the literature. And to give a shorter answer to this is that typically we see research comparing longitudinal studies in parallel groups designs. And so we'll have this group doing training program A and this group doing training program B. Let's take that failure versus non-failure, high volume versus low volume. And then on average, we might see that the higher volume group, I stopped myself mid-pantomime trucks, that the high volume group gets a little bit more growth than the low volume group. But that doesn't mean that everybody benefited from the high volume. If you recall, not too long ago, there was a study from Ennis et al., and I did a video review of this in Mass and talked about it on office hours. And they said up to 52 sets per week, things tended to trend toward more muscle growth with 52 versus 42 versus 22 sets per week. But in that 52 sets per week, there were people that barely had any muscle growth. And some people in the 22 sets per week had more muscle growth than those in the 52 sets per week. And when you do a parallel groups design and somebody does high volume versus low volume, you don't know how everybody in the high volume group would have done if they did the low volume group. So let's say that somebody only increased their cross-sectional area by 2% by doing 52 sets per week in that study. Well, if on average 52 sets is better, we say more volume is better. And perhaps the person that only increased by 2% is just a relatively low responder, and they would only increase by 1% or 0% in the 22 set. But perhaps they would have increased muscle growth by 10% in the 22 set, meaning that individually they respond better to lower volume. But when you do a parallel groups design, you can't test that. You don't know that. So the way to go about this would be to do a within participants design, in that you would have individuals train one limb with the higher volume, that 52 sets, and then the other limb with the 22 sets. And then you could see how they respond to both protocols. So you're not just getting what's going on at the group level, you're getting how that individual would respond to both. And then we can make a bit better predictions. So far we've demonstrated that it exists. We could discuss how research designs could be a little bit better. Now I want to talk about how we currently deal with it in practice and then how to predict it.
When you say in practice, you mean in the gym, right?
In the gym, in the trenches, coaches and lifters and athletes. And this is where if you're here in the chat tonight and you have any opinions, let us know what you do, right? What are you doing in practice to try and account for individualization? And so the biggest thing I'm doing, right, is there's a lot of trial and error. And, when I have somebody and I'm going to ask them all of their questions as they're starting up as a client, and then we're going to get rolling. I'm going to know what they're previously doing for, let's say, their magnitude of volume. And I'm going to start them off somewhere around, the recommendations, kind of population level recommendations. And if they were doing, really, really high volume before and responding well to it, maybe a little higher than that. And as we progress, we're going to see, I'm going to get to know, all right, they're about 70% of their 1RM. They did 8 reps. It was a 2 RIR. It didn't look great on video. Perhaps they're not somebody that can do a lot of reps. Maybe they don't handle as much volume as they think they do because of that. And then I'll adjust based upon there. So we have a lot of this trial and error, and we have to go back and look at previous training blocks and test these things out. But ultimately, what I think the goal is with this, and whether we ever get there or not, I don't know, is to be able to predict these things. If we can have practical predictors and you can have a practical measure, and some client comes to you and you say, oh, your femur length is this. I know that you're going to do about this many reps on squat at 80% of 1RM. So I'm going to program this amount of reps for you, right? Or, I know that your body mass is this. And because of that, you're going to be better or worse at doing reps. So I'm going to program this for you, right? That's what ultimately we want to get to. So let's give a couple examples on this, right? So the one I just mentioned is in that previous study we talked about where they did 6 to 28 reps during one set to failure at 70% of 1RM on squat. They also found the beta coefficient, and that said that for every 1 kilogram change in body mass, there was an inverse change of reps performed of 0.10. So if somebody weighed 70 kilograms and then they went and they could do 10 reps, they went to 71, then they would be doing 9.9 reps on average. But that doesn't mean that actually applies to any specific person, right? That's just the general relationship that was there. So that's not something we can really use, and it's so far away from being able to practically use it. Perhaps, and we look at volume, somebody's aerobic capacity matters for this. So perhaps their VO2 max, right? They could do a sub-max test and predict VO2 max if they didn't want to go all out. There's walking VO2 max protocols. Potentially they could do this, and that could predict, hey, how much volume this person could handle, or could predict their hypertrophy response. It's difficult to say, but that's something we could do. Their limb lengths, maybe a personality test of some kind could help with what type of training they respond to, whether it's an auto-regulated protocol or a more fixed, a more rigid protocol. All of these things are there, Trex, but we can't quite know what is going to predict these responses. We do have some insight with salivary testosterone before training sessions. We do have some insight that those that can do more volume is related to ribosomal biogenesis, and ribosomes are there to construct proteins. And so, yes, we have some predictors, but they're not practical. Nobody's using molecular biology techniques before they train to be able to then predict how much volume they should do, or to predict what their acute state is in terms of, let's say, their testosterone to cortisol ratio and their immediate performance. So it's these practical predictors. So ultimately, I do think that individualization is the most pressing question that we have. And I, for one, am not that interested in seeing study after study looking at training program A versus training program B with 7 subjects in each group. And I don't mean that as a knock. I've done those studies and needed to do those studies, right? One of them was my dissertation. It's what you need to do. But when I look at all those and I think of all this stuff, how much can we really take from that data anymore? So I do think individualization is a very pressing question. It definitely exists. I think we can look at it better within subjects' designs. We do deal with it a lot in trial and error, and it would be nice to get some practical predictors. Are we there yet? No, but I think people are working on it, and we'll see what happens. So I hope you said you were going to sit back and enjoy. I don't know if you enjoyed, but hopefully you got to at least relax a little bit.
I did enjoy, but I do have a follow-up question. So perhaps I'm being naive here, but you mentioned, in research within subjects' designs, within participant designs are an ideal avenue for trying to kind of figure out how much people are responding to different types of programs. Would it be advisable for a person to just do their own kind of so for example, I have a leg extension machine at my gym. Maybe I'm willing to just do an experiment and say, I'm going to do higher reps on my right leg. I'm going to do, lower reps on my left leg, or I'm going to do more volume on this leg than that leg. Like, would you consider it advisable to go ahead and do your own kind of unilateral experiment like that and see how it goes? Or, if you wanted to maybe tiptoe into those waters and not commit that much, you could do very different programs for your upper body and your lower body at the same time, so that that stress and sleep and diet is not going to be a confounding factor. I guess one challenge there, if folks who have been listening to Office Hours for a while, Helms talked recently about how his upper body needs a lot more volume than his lower body does. So you might find that perhaps you even respond differentially across different muscle groups with different type of programming strategies. But how do you feel about the idea? Is it really feasible for a person to walk into the gym and say, hey, I'm going to do my own little unofficial case study here?
I honestly love the idea. I don't know if it's something, well, I shouldn't say I don't know if it's something I do for a very long term, because I think you'd want to see how it plays out over the short term first.
Yeah, 12, 16 weeks.
I don't see a whole lot of downside. And I understand at first somebody might be worried about asymmetry, right? Say, well, if I train my right arm this way and my left arm this way, and the protocol on the right arm works better, that you'll be able to even that out over time. You'll be able to recover that. I wouldn't be too concerned about that. I would have some fun and see how it works. The other thing I think that you'll gauge from it, because you probably won't have laboratory metrics to be able to test what's going on. How much did my biceps grow? But you'll have, of course, an old school tape measure or some other ways to be able to measure that to enough of an extent. But you'll also gauge how you feel. You'll also gauge, is this something I enjoy? How beat up am I after this session? You could probably do some recovery type of metrics. Let's say you trained one arm to failure and one arm not to failure. Something that I've been questioning for a while, and I know my students have as well, and we've had some good discussions around it, is, a lot of the knock on failure training, and I'm going to sound like a pro failure guy here, but Trucks can vouch to the contrary, is that, a lot of knock on failure training is that it causes a lot more fatigue than non-failure training and muscle damage, and it elongates the recovery period. However, those studies doing that are only 1 week or 2 weeks long. So as we know with training, the repeated bout effect occurs. When you repeat a bout of exercise, you get an effect of less damage. And so over time, if let's say failure training causes more fatigue than non-failure training over a week, well, after 8 weeks of doing failure training on your right arm and non-failure training on your left arm, that's volume equated. Do you really expect more fatigue or more muscle damage in the right arm than the left arm in week 8? Maybe not. So you could test something like that and say, all right, well, I wasn't recovering as quickly, but I did adapt to this protocol. Similarly, how somebody adapts to more volume, right? We don't really question. We say, all right, somebody's doing 10 sets per week. Over time, they're going to adapt to the 15 sets. Maybe they adapt to the failure training. So I think for those reasons too, Trex, it would be a good idea to experiment with that. How do you feel from it? Do you have motivation to continue training? And you might realize, wow, I'm really growing a lot with this, but I don't want to keep doing this, or I'm really growing a lot with this style, but I only can really sustain it for 16 weeks at a time. Similar to, like, let's say volume cycling, then you might back off a little bit. So I would absolutely encourage that. I think it would be a fun thing to do.
Yeah. I think that's a really important thing. Folks who listen to Iron Culture, they know our last episode, Helms and I were talking a lot with Omar, of course, about the whole science versus kind of, in the trenches type knowledge, anecdotes versus scientific evidence, and how some folks lean in a little bit too aggressively and too rigidly about taking all their training straight out of PubMed. And I think this conversation is a good example of where you should feel encouraged to do some self-experimentation in the gym and to trust your eyes and to trust the feedback that you're getting in terms of how you seem to be adapting to your training. Because, the research, you can find, a small study comparing high versus low volume, high frequency versus low frequency. You can find all these little studies and glean some insights from them, but they, so far are not really equipped to tell you as an individual exactly what kind of training you're going to respond best to. But they do give great ideas for troubleshooting, right? So when you get into a plateau and you say, you know what, now that I think about it, I've been doing pretty low frequency for a pretty long time. I wonder if high frequency might be something that kind of nudges me to kind of a next level of progress. And frequency is just an example there. It could be anything, but you can look at these small trials, these small interventions to get ideas about what kind of variables might be worth tweaking, but you should not always assume that your response is going to be perfectly reflected in the average response in a particular study. And that's where individualization comes into play. And it's really weird to me that some people think that idea of going into the gym and experimenting and kind of trusting your own eyes in terms of your responses, a lot of people view that somehow as being like unscientific because you're not just trusting whatever the latest meta-analysis says on the matter. And it's not remotely unscientific whatsoever because, we happen to know based on good evidence that there is, this variability from person to person. So in a way, it would be really unscientific to assume that you're always going to respond exactly like the average person. Mike, it looks like you're typing up there. What do we got going on in there in the chat?
Well, I'm just responding to a question, looking for a little bit more information on one question here. I was going to say hi to Tina. She was here last time I was here, and she chimed in again, so appreciate her coming back. And I was also going to write my man Jacob here. And Trex, I'm honestly a little offended. You're always talking about your hashtags. I got one tonight, and I didn't hear you mention it. It just seems a little biased.
I didn't get to those yet. I wait for the hashtags until about halfway through when people they need that little pick me up. They need that dose of Zourdopamine to kind of get them jazzed up.
Nailed it. All is forgiven.
Yeah. So yeah, we got normally people go into the live chat on YouTube here and they'll mention Trex Nation or the Trex Army. Trextopia is the one tonight, and that was accompanied by Zourdopamine, which is probably the best one in terms of word form and relevance. So
obviously,
yeah, that's a really good one. There was a question here in the chat. We were talking a little bit about obviously individualization of training, and this isn't directly related to individualization, but it is a strategy that is kind of people try to use this strategy to make an assessment of people and then individualize their needs from there and kind of plan their training accordingly. So we had a question in here: are movement assessments done to see how much motor patterns or body mechanics influence results? So movement assessments, it's one of those areas where there is science on movement assessments, but there's also a lot of pseudoscience on movement assessments. And there's a lot of anecdotes surrounding movement assessments. It's not unusual to find some kind of guru who uses science-sounding terminology to tell you why they can do a quick 5-minute assessment with some basic movements and then tell you what your strengths are, what your weaknesses are, what your injury risk is, and how you should be training. Now, I don't spend a lot of time in the movement assessment literature. I'll be completely candid about that. I usually stick to the stuff I know, which is nutrition, metabolism, body composition, and a little bit of training stuff, but mostly for health and hypertrophy. So I don't do a lot of movement assessment stuff, but my general take as someone who has done a substantial amount of coaching in the trenches, so to speak, is I've never really had a use for movement assessments or movement screens. I've seen a lot of folks argue that they are good predictors of future injury risk, and I don't think that the evidence in that regard is particularly strong. I think predicting injury risk is a very difficult thing to do, and it tends to be extremely context dependent. Another claim that people will make, aside from the injury side of things, people will do a movement screen and try to use it to kind of set boundaries for what you can or cannot do in the gym as an athlete. They'll say, oh yeah, you're going to be bad at this lift because you did poor on this movement screen. And again, I don't think that that's particularly helpful. I think if someone comes to me as a trainer or a coach and they want to get better at something, we basically work our way up the progressions, right? We figure out where a suitable starting point is for that person, and then we work our way to what we can do safely and effectively. So if someone comes in and says, hey, I want to be a great squatter, I'm not going to do a, generic movement screen or movement assessment and then say, it turns out you actually suck at squatting. So anyway, we'll focus on something else. No, if they come to me and say, I want to be a great squatter, we will figure out where the best entry point for them is, right? So we'll start, maybe it's a body weight squat, maybe it's a goblet squat, wherever we have to start, we'll start there and we'll work our way up our progressions, move closer and closer to a barbell back squat. And hopefully we'll get there in due time, or along the way, we might find that actually it's not the right movement for them, right? But we'll get there through that process of working through the progressions. When I look at the research on movement screens, I tend to be very underwhelmed, which is why I don't spend a lot of time in that research anyway. Zourdos, do you have any opinions on the matter?
I feel similarly to you, and it's also not my main area of interest, but I did bring this something up here that to this day remains one of my favorite Mass articles, which was written in Volume 1, Issue 4. It was a guest article we had by physical therapist Derek Miles. And the title of his article was Functional Movement Screen is Not Supported for Injury Prevention. And so this study here just looked at essentially the FMS, the Functional Movement Screen, and he was able to conclude that essentially the necessary steps to predict injury, such as the screen establishing an association between risk factors and subsequent injuries, validating those testing procedures, just hadn't happened enough in controlled studies. Yeah. Now, that was a few years ago now, but it doesn't seem that this is a very, very reliable, this movement screen in particular, right, of predicting injury. And so if you're a subscriber to Mass, I would recommend going all the way back to Volume 1, Issue 4 and checking out that article from Dr. Miles.
Yeah, and I don't want to give away too many spoilers, but we also have an article coming up February 1st that is about movement screens. And I don't want to give too much away. I want to leave a little bit of excitement there for our subscribers, but I would argue that it makes a pretty compelling case that movement screens also fall a bit short when trying to predict who may or may not be experiencing lower back pain. So sometimes folks, this is another point I wanted to make about movement screens. One of the things that kind of irks me about them is they tend to reinforce narratives about movement that I don't believe to be true, which is that there is necessarily a right way and a wrong way to move. And if you move the wrong way, it's just a matter of time before that manifests as a painful injury that involves damaged tissue, right? I think that narrative sounds, plausible. It sounds perhaps even intuitive, but what we tend to find with movement is that if you move in a particular way that isn't just absolutely disastrous and you kind of build up to a particular workload with that type of movement, the human body's pretty adaptable, and so someone could move a little bit differently than others when performing a particular task during some kind of standardized screening. And as long as they're managing the loading of those critical tissues when they're doing that movement, it's quite a leap of faith to suggest that it will necessarily eventually result in tissue damage or a painful injury. So I think that movement screens a lot of times put a lot of weight on that general type of narrative or that conceptual view of pain and injury, which I think increasingly is becoming difficult to justify when you look at the mounting evidence that seems to point us more toward a biopsychosocial model of pain. And when it comes to injury, all the research trying to predict injury, it is a crapshoot. It is very, very difficult to do. And the more complex the task, the harder it gets. All right, so I want to dive into the chat here and answer a couple other questions. So here's a good one. The question is from Andrew. Andrew's got two questions. So the first one I'm going to kick to you, Mike. If I do 2 sets of 10 reps for my delts, can I still consider that a rest day? I'm going to say yes. If we're talking about delts and you're saying lateral raises, I'm saying yes.
Yeah, this reminds me of training and then, having some dumbbells in your garage, walking by, you're off that day, but I'm just going to pick up the the 30s and
take them for a ride.
Yeah, I'm gonna do that. I'm going to see some friends. Why not?
Yeah,
why not get a few in? Yeah, I think it's a rest. I think and not to be funny, I think the how I would put this is it's literally a day that you did 2 sets of 10 reps on lateral raises, right?
Yeah.
So and what I mean by that is like we have this discussion of counting volume over the past however many years now as everybody's gotten into set volumes, and then you can count indirect sets, right? So a set of lat pull downs could also be a set of biceps. To me, like a set of bench press could be a set of triceps. To me, a set of bench press is a set of bench press. And I just count it that way. And so is that an off day? Sure, it's an off day in the sense that you didn't go do a full training session. Are you going to be fatigued? No. Does it really matter? No. Did it also probably help your delts? I don't know. But sure, I guess so. But it's a day where you did 2 sets of 10 reps on lateral raises is how I would put it, meaning that it's not a day that's probably going to affect anything else. So I wouldn't worry about it. So if you want to count it as a rest day in the sense that I can fully train tomorrow because I didn't do that much work today, I would say, sure, go for it. But yeah, I would just say it's a day that you did 2 sets of 10 reps on lateral raises, just like 3 sets of bench presses, 3 sets of bench press.
Yeah, I would imagine this question comes from the perspective, a lot of folks have pretty rigid heuristics where they say, like, you have to take at least 1 day off a week, right? That's a really common one in lifting. And so that's a heuristic that I don't necessarily subscribe to, because I think that heuristic has a very big assumption baked into it, which is that training is either full or zero, right? It's like that heuristic works if you're saying you should not be doing brutal, really high volume training sessions with, high intensity 7 days a week in perpetuity. For most people, probably not going to be able to pull that off very effectively. But I would say if you want to do 2 sets of 10 lateral raises every day for the rest of your life, I can't, I don't think you're ever going to run into a day where you say, man, those 2 sets yesterday are really catching up to me. Yeah.
But to get back to, circle back to something you asked earlier, which was in terms of the within subjects design, you said, hey, would you experiment with high or low volume? Similarly, if let's say delts are a problem muscle group for you, and you want to experiment with 2 or 3 sets of lateral raises every single day for a couple of months, go for it.
Yeah, why not?
This is a different topic than does that count as a rest day, but why not? I mean, you're talking to a guy that max squatted over 150 days in a row. So I have no issue with training frequently. Try it out. See how it works. It's most likely going to be additional volume than what you're doing. And when it comes to training frequency, one of the things that, and I'm just going rogue now, one of the things that we say, all right, well, we don't want to train more than 3 days a week or something like that. Sure, if you're using a typical training program where you're doing, 8 sets, 7 sets on a muscle group each session, close to failure, and you're pretty fatigued. But if all you're doing on that is a couple sets of 10 that are sub-maximal, you can do that every day. Does that work better than doing more sets across fewer days? Not necessarily. We know that from the training frequency literature, volume is equated. The number of training days might not matter, but that could be a way to actually get more volume, right? So again, this is a different question than, is that an off day? Is it an off day? Sure. But if you want to experiment with doing that, let's say every day for a while, why not?
Yeah, I agree. And Andrew had a second question unrelated to the first. The question was, what % of a usual training day protein intake am I allowed to have on a rest day? Or do I need to go to 100% of my normal protein intake on rest days? So training days, I have a certain protein threshold. Do I have to hit that on rest days, or should I be below that? My general approach is to keep my protein steady every single day. Theoretically, when we lift, it's not like we set necessarily a 24-hour clock pertaining to the anabolic and catabolic processes for that muscle group. We have consistently, throughout the week, we have this kind of ongoing sequence where we're stimulating certain muscle groups. They're growing for a certain period of time. There's catabolic periods as well. We've got the peaks and valleys after meals and then during fasting periods. So protein synthesis and protein breakdown are going to be ebbing and flowing throughout the entire week. So I try not to get too granular where I'm trying to have, these higher protein days around training and lower protein days away from training. So I usually just go to 100%. I keep my protein intake habits pretty consistent across the board. Now, if that sounds like a chore to you, if you hear that and you say, crap, I have to get all that protein in on my off days too, that sucks, I don't want to do that, I would hazard a guess that you might be eating more protein than you actually need. Maybe. It's possible that you just hate protein sources. They just don't really fit your appetite and your kind of palate very well. That's certainly possible. It's possible that you have a really low appetite. But most of the time, in my experience, when I'm talking with folks and they tell me that hitting their protein target is a chore, I sit down with them and I say, what is your protein target? And they tell it to me and I say, yeah, that does sound like a chore, but I don't think you really need to go that high. And so I'm a little bit, Mike, you are on a particular end of the spectrum in the conversation about how close to failure does someone need to train in order to get a pretty robust hypertrophy stimulus, right? And we always give you, I always poke you in the ribs about that. One place where I'm kind of far on one end of the spectrum is when it comes to protein needs for lifters. And it's not that I necessarily disagree with common recommendations. It's that I believe that common recommendations are embraced to a level that's not justified by the strength of the evidence. So what I mean by that is, if you ask someone in the lifting world, how much protein should I have? Everyone will say 1.6 to 2.2 grams of protein per kilogram of body mass per day. It's second nature. It rolls off the tongue. Everybody says it. And there is good evidence to point to that as a totally viable range. But there's really not good evidence, in my opinion, to suggest that 1.6 is meaningfully different than 1.4. And I would argue that most people can even make some pretty darn good gains on 1.2 grams per kilogram per day. And if dropping from 1.6 to 2.2 has a meaningful impact on your quality of life, I would make that change today and I wouldn't think twice about it, because you can make very, very good gains on 1.2 grams per kilogram per day. And then I throw on the additional caveat, when everybody treats that range, that recommendation, as if it's, beyond reproach, you can't possibly question or disagree with it. I would also say I would totally challenge the premise that that's even the best way to quantify protein intake. Grams per kilogram of total body mass. I don't think I can't imagine anyone would look at me with a straight face and say, if I gained 40 pounds of fat tonight, I need to be eating more protein tomorrow in order to promote muscle growth. I don't think anybody would actually hold that belief and really mean it. And so what that tells us is, well, body mass probably isn't the right denominator in that equation, right? What is the right denominator? I'm not sure. I think fat-free mass is probably better. But it's still probably not perfect. But all of that is to say, I usually keep my protein intake pretty stable from day to day, because, we're kind of always trying to influence this balance of anabolic and catabolic processes. And if hitting your protein target seems like an absolute chore and you're just begging for a day off of hitting that protein target, I would give some real consideration to dropping that protein target. And you might not be making as much of a sacrifice as you think in the process of doing that. Mike, you see anything in the chat that you want to address?
I do. I want to take, if it's okay with you, 1 second and maybe kind of ask you a little question on something you just said that got me thinking a little bit, just kicking around in my head.
Sure.
So when you say, and I love the way you frame this, which is there's good evidence to be able to suggest 1.6 grams per kilogram to 2.2, but there's not good evidence to, really say that's definitely where you have to be. Outside of that range, 1.2 isn't going to be good. And to me, that's really a larger kind of part of the larger concept with the recommendations, right? when we get recommendations from governing bodies or from governments or so forth, it doesn't mean those recommendations aren't on target. But sometimes I think people then tend to look at those, and they say, oh, American Heart Association says I need 60 minutes of exercise per day, or I need this many minutes per week, or I need this many servings of fruits and vegetables. And then if they get just slightly above that or below that, the world's coming to an end. When in reality, the acceptable range is probably much broader than what's being suggested. And of course, it varies among the individual. And I think we see this in lifting a lot, which is, well, here's how much volume I should be doing per week. And I did slightly less than that. And, now I'm not going to grow. I know when I first started running, I'd say to my coach, like, yeah, can I flip flop these days? Can I do the long run today because I have stuff with the family on the weekend and I have to start running at this time and that's just not going to work. And I'd think, oh well, if I do, I got to stop my watch at exactly 12 miles. If I stop it at 12.3 or 11.8, and she would go, Mike, it does not matter.
Yeah,
it does not matter. If you ran 11.94 and you're supposed to do 12, I do not care.
Yeah,
and things like that. So do you feel that we are kind of in that situation with a lot of things? And especially with some of these recommendations that come out from governing bodies, again, not that they're wrong recommendations, but with all of those things, do you feel there's any issue with being slightly, outside of that given range?
No, I mean, any target, you have to bake in the fact that there's going to be variability and a bit of a cushion around that. So, for instance, I know some folks might hear what we're saying and be a little bit confused because it sounds like I'm saying there's good evidence for this protein range, but there's not good evidence against being outside of that range. I know for a lot of people that, on the surface, sounds very contradictory, but what I mean by that can be explained by the actual paper where that recommendation got popularized, right? So that paper was doing a meta-regression. They said, at what point, statistically or mathematically, can we say that an individual has had enough protein to maximize their gains, right? That's basically what they were trying to operationalize with their model. And what they found was that number was 1.6. And the 95% confidence interval ranged from, I think, 1.2 to 2.2 grams per kilogram per day. So now the researchers said, well, if we're trying to make sure we're getting enough protein, you probably want to be on the top end of that very wide range, based on what the statistical model kicked out. But from a pure, like, if you asked a pure statistician, what is the optimal amount of protein, they would look at that model and they would say, you can't really say that the top half of that confidence interval is more meaningful than the bottom half, right? It's a symmetrical confidence interval where we think that the kind of target value that we're shooting for is somewhere around 1.6, but who knows? Maybe it is 1.3, and who knows? Maybe it is 1.9, right? So the way that range got popularized was basically by doing a statistical model, but then layering over that the kind of preference to say, well, let's better be safe than sorry, right? But what I'm getting at is that if you actually try to go in and find some strong research indicating that 1.6 grams per kilogram is better than 1.4, you're actually going to have a tough time. And not just because there's a lack of evidence, but even when you look at these studies in these different meta-regressions, you're going to find that folks who are eating 1.3 grams per kilogram per day tend to do pretty much just as well as the folks that are eating 1.6 in the actual studies. So that's what I'm getting at there. And like you're alluding to, Mike, I think that it goes for a lot of things, right? So another area where this comes up all the time is with step counts. A lot of people say, how many step counts do I need, or how many steps per day do I need in order to kind of say, okay, I did the appropriate amount for my health and wellness today. I did enough steps. And, people will say 10,000 per day. That's kind of a common heuristic. And then there's all these meta-regressions, these meta-analyses that come out and they say, no, it needs to be, 6,000 a day if you're elderly, or 8,000 a day if you're younger. And then some say there is no threshold. It's just linear. The more you do, the better. And I think what people need to kind of understand with those types of models is that when you look at them in the aggregate, it seems like, yeah, generally speaking, more is better, but there is kind of diminishing returns. And if you take it to the extreme, that can become a very counterproductive habit. If you're trying to just walk all day like a hamster in a wheel, that's not going to be a high quality of life. You're not going to enjoy it. The cons they're going to dramatically outweigh the pros of getting the high step count. And so what I usually tell people is, well, let's see where we're at and let's add 1,000 a day. And when that seems totally easy and manageable, let's add another 1,000. And let's see if we can get up into that 8 to 10,000 step a day range. And, we can go from there if we need to. So I think it gets really frustrating when people look at science and ask it to deliver something that it's not really equipped to deliver, which is a universally generalizable, exact, precise estimate of exactly what every person needs. And so that goes for protein intake, it goes for set volume, it goes for step counts. It pretty much holds across the board that what we're really trying to do is get we're trying to kind of triangulate and tighten our estimate around a range, but we're almost never going to get that exact precise cutoff that everybody seems to find so satisfying, but always will elude us.
Yeah, and so the question now, and thanks for entertaining that for me, that I see in the chat, I want to chat with you real quick is, so Philip M., who has been here on a number of episodes, good to see you again, man, says, at what point would you think that rucking crosses from good walking experience to essentially a glorified farmer's walk and thus an interference effect? So Philip's essentially asking a concurrent training question here, right? So the interference effect being, and I talked about this last time I was on office hours, and so we typically think of the interference effect as a negative connotation. So if you're a lifter, and when you add in aerobic exercise, what is the interference effect? How does it negatively affect strength, hypertrophy, power, things like that? Now, rucking, and Trex, maybe fill me in, or Philip, correct me if I'm giving an incorrect, I should say, definition here, is to an extent essentially weighted walking, hiking. You're going to have a backpack. I think they call it a rucksack. So I don't want to misuse terms. I'm not, I haven't partaken in this exercise. But, I have a rucksack, do some weighted walking, some hiking, could do this pretty frequently. And so when I think of the interference effect, I think of an aerobic exercise that is going to have a physiological negative effect on hypertrophy and strength and power. So that could be due to decreased anabolic signaling. It could be due to asynchronous firing of motor units with aerobic exercise, more so than the synchronous firing of motor units that occurs with resistance exercise. When I think of rucking, I don't think of that. I think of something that could actually benefit strength. If you're walking with this heavy sack for a while. Now, could it be detrimental to strength? I think acutely, yes, in the sense that if you're going to squat the next day and then you're rucking for a long time the day before, your legs might be sore. You might be fatigued when you go in the gym the next day, and your lower body workout might not be so good. So I think of it as something that, sure, it could interfere with strength acutely. It could interfere with your progress in the gym, but I wouldn't think of it as a quintessential interference effect that we would think of with concurrent training. Now, if you did it for hours and hours at a time every day, maybe, but still, I would think of it more as it does interfere, or it can interfere if the dosage is high enough. Now, at what point, that's very difficult to say. It's very difficult to say that, hey, after 40 minutes, you're going to see this negative effect, because I don't think it causes the interference effect in the same physiological way. I think it can interfere practically because of the fatigue that's associated with it. But that fatigue is going to differ for each individual. It's going to differ for the time. It's going to differ for the amount of weight. It's going to differ for the terrain that you're on as well. So I think I would just be logical and reasonable about it, which is that after you do it, if you always feel kind of beat up and you don't feel you can train again for a couple of days in terms of lifting, then it's probably too much. If you feel pretty fine and you're doing it 20 minutes or so at a time with a reasonable amount of weight, then it's probably not going to be a big deal at all. So I do think it can interfere if the dosage is high enough, but I don't think it's going to cause the quintessential physiological interference effect, which, by the way, takes a pretty high dosage of aerobic exercise in the first place to cause that effect.
Yeah, Mike, I totally agree with the parts that I heard, but I'm not going to lie, I was daydreaming. I heard we started talking about hiking, and I know rucking is different than the leisurely hiking I like to do, but man, today it was warm out for the first time in a couple weeks, and I was just thinking about spring, man. And there's this hiking trail over by a lake near my house. My wife and I go out there, and there's a sandy beach, lay down a towel and just look up at the blue sky. Man, I was daydreaming hard. We're so close to the spring, Mike. You don't know what that's like, though, because you're in Florida.
See, you're longing for spring, and all I can tell you is that I'm dreading it, because right now, using my weather skills, otherwise known as the super handy weather app that everybody else can look up to, it was up to 81 degrees here in South Florida.
Man.
The low of only 72. By the way, that's a humidity of 100%. So it's not exactly cool. Now, next week, we're going to be down to the high 40s in the morning. And oh man,
whoa,
what a time to run.
Oh, yeah, that'll be good.
I am very excited for that. But it is going to be in the 80s all week, up to 85 this coming Sunday. And we don't get winter here.
Yeah.
But the winter is the time that makes living in South Florida worth it, because you get what my dad and I call the good times.
Yeah.
And so I'll send him a screenshot of the phone in the morning if it's ever 50 degrees, which is like 3 times a year. And I'm like, the good times.
Yeah. I hear you.
So I want it to stay.
I can't really complain about the winter. I live in North Carolina. It's not like I'm up in New England or anything, or, Wisconsin. But anyway, man, I'm excited for sunny skies and hiking. It's always the best. And folks in the chat, I love hearing about less conventional ways of getting exercise, because I think a lot of people think about, they know they should be more active outside of just lifting in the gym, but people think that means they have to, tether themselves to a treadmill and kind of, try to find a way to make it not so miserable. But get in the chat. Tell me all about your kayaking and your paddle boarding and your hiking, and give people ideas for getting out there and being active. There was another question here. Oh, yeah. So we have a question from Perhaps, or Perhap5. I assume the 5 is supposed to be an S there. How often should you rotate exercises to avoid joint pain? As soon as an issue creeps up, or preemptively swap out exercises on kind of like a fixed timeline? So I would say I have a rule. If I'm doing an accessory exercise and it is causing any amount of discomfort, I swap it. And I insist with the clients that I work with, if you're doing a certain type of tricep extension exercise and it's bothering you, dear God, we have 900 ways that we can try to train your triceps. You should not be putting up with that nagging elbow pain when you're doing tricep extensions. Like, if it really is isolated to that particular accessory movement, just pick a different one. There's a million ways to curl a dumbbell. There's a million ways to do tricep extensions. So I say, if you're a power lifter and you're having a little tiny bit of pain on the bench press, okay, that's tricky, because powerlifters need to do bench press, at least if a competition's coming up, right? I mean, eventually we're going to have to do that comfortably. But yeah, for accessories, I really do have a zero tolerance policy, to be honest. Because accessories are completely replaceable. And honestly, if you're just training for health or just training for your physique, if you don't have a specific lifting goal in mind for a particular exercise, then I hate to break it to you, but every exercise is actually an accessory exercise. When you really get down to it, everything's optional. Now, getting to the premise of the question, which is, there's kind of an assumption baked in, which is that if you do an exercise too long and you're not rotating, eventually you're going to run into this joint pain. And I don't necessarily see it that way. I mean, I definitely have had times in my lifting career where I felt that way. And as I've gotten older and more experienced and looked back on it, I have come to find that in those scenarios, it's not that I wasn't rotating exercises frequently enough. It's that I was either mismanaging my load progression and just I was pushing a lift past what my muscles could handle. And so then the tissues nearby started to take a little more brunt of that training. So sometimes it was inappropriate load management and trying to do too much too quickly, not recovering effectively. In other cases, it's just that I was blatantly neglecting muscle groups, right? So it's not that I should have been swapping out different shoulder exercises. It's that I let a particular, group of muscles near my shoulders basically just get very weak, and so like sometimes letting a muscle get totally untrained and totally weak will actually contribute to some pain. I took a pretty extended time off of lifting fairly recently, and like I kind of got that thing that you've probably heard your parents or grandparents talk about when you just get out of bed and you hurt. And I didn't really have that as much when I was, lifting consistently. And I did start to notice from that time off that like letting muscles get weak, it hurts. Like I would start to like have pain in my knees from not training, which was really weird and something that I didn't really expect. So a lot of times when we talk about people who are experiencing pain and attributing it to a lack of, this kind of cyclical moving exercises around, I think most of the time it's improper load management, or it's just an imbalanced program that's allowing certain muscle groups to get weak to the point that they're actually contributing to pain. So like this came up at a prior episode of Office Hours. Someone asked a little bit about like, do you have to balance your pushing and pulling exercises in order to prevent joint pain? And in that answer and explanation, I said, I don't think so. I don't think when people are getting that shoulder pain, it's because they bench press too much. I think it's because they just let, their pulling musculature just get really weak, So it's not that your pulling musculature has to necessarily keep up 100% with your pushing musculature. It's just that you can't have either side be, legitimately weak in an absolute sense. You don't need to like perfectly find that balance between the two. You just need both of them to be strong. And if you happen to bench a lot more than you row, no big deal, as far as I can see. Mike, what do you think?
Yeah. In terms of joint pain, it's not an area that I'm super, super well versed in, but in terms of a lot of things with training, I do agree with Trex that if, this exercise typically causes this pain and it's an assistance exercise, let's say you're a powerlifter, you don't need to do it, right? You can do something else. You probably should do something else. Why deal with that? I think we've all been kind of in that situation, at least I was for a while, where it's like, well, I have to do this exercise specifically to grow this part of the muscle. It hurts, but whatever. I need to do preacher curls, or I need to do cable curls, or whatever it might be. But I would look at it from the perspective of what's your personal history, in that, do you always get joint pain with every exercise after it's in your program for 6 weeks? If you always do, and there's no way around it, no matter if you manipulate the exercises, manipulate the volume, whatever it might be, then in that case, I would probably rotate them out. So after every 3-4 weeks, I would preempt that and say, I'm going to be proactive here. This occurs after every 6 weeks. So, all right, I'm going to take these T-bar rows out, or I'm going to take the slap pull down out, whatever it might be, preemptively. If that's not something that happens, and it's happened every once in a while for whatever reason, then I don't know if it's something I'd worry about. I would probably go ahead and train. And then if you get the one-off joint pain there, then go ahead and switch. So what's your history with it? If your history that it does happen all the time, and you want to lift, you have to lift. The only way for that joint pain not to occur is to not lift. If you're going to train, then just preempt it. Say, all right, typically happens week 5 or 6. I'm going to be safe. Switch this out of week 3, go to something else. I'm not sure why that would happen, unless it's an overuse injury from doing too much volume. But I also might look at those other training variables and say, if this does always happen, what's the reason? And do I really need to switch the exercise, or do I need to go ahead and adjust my training variables, maybe take a deload, something like that? So what's your history? Then be proactive based upon the history.
Yeah. And since you mentioned deload, and by the way, I agree, that's a very pragmatic thing. So like when we get these questions, my initial thought is to kind of break down the question and figure out what are the assumptions underlying the question, and how can we troubleshoot, and what are the real factors we need to explore. But from a purely pragmatic standpoint, I agree. Like if you just find that you feel better when you're rotating exercises every 3 weeks, by all means do it, because there's nothing wrong with having variety, and in many ways it leads to more complete development. There's been studies looking at lower body and upper body musculature where they basically indicate, if you're going to do 12 sets for a particular muscle group, why not do 4 exercises, 3 sets each, rather than doing just the same thing over and over? It seems to ultimately develop more well-rounded muscularity. So for example, there's a lower body study where more exercise variety led to more even growth, across the vastus, medialis, lateralis, etc. So across, all the quadricep muscles, there's just more balance with that growth because the muscle is getting trained in different angles, different planes of movement, that kind of thing. So, nothing wrong with being pragmatic, but I think we answered that one pretty robustly. But it did remind me, because Mike, you mentioned the idea of deloading. We got a couple questions about deloading that have been sitting in my outline, and I've just been waiting to get to them. And this is probably the right time to do it. So one person asked on Instagram, is it possible? Oh, by the way, if you're looking for us and you want to find a million ways to ask us questions, for the best way by far is to join the live chat. The second best way by far is to use the link in the description of this episode. Then there's a huge gap. All these other methods are way worse. But if you're looking for us and trying to find us, we are on Instagram at Mass Research Review. And if you're looking for our YouTube handle, it's youtube.com/@MassResearchReview.
Could they send to our P.O. box?
No, do not send it to the P.O. box because that's probably never been checked. But we had a question from Instagram. Is it possible you'll lose myofibrillar hypertrophy during a deload? So the idea here is, are you actually losing contractile tissue in your muscles by virtue of taking a deload? And that one, I just wanted to address it quickly because deloads tend to cause a lot of confusion. We get a lot of questions about them, not in a meaningful way. I mean, your muscle protein content is always going to be fluctuating a little bit. Like I said, you're always kind of synthesizing and breaking down. But I certainly would not hesitate to take a deload because I thought I was going to lose muscle or strength during that deload. You can take a week out of the gym, no big deal. And usually with a deload, you're still going to do some kind of light training of some type. You're going to be relatively active. I think a lot of times, folks will get really worked up about time off from training because they've seen timelines that come from immobilization studies. So Zourdos, we've seen these studies time and time again. They're great studies because they're a very extreme model of research, but they will literally put your leg in a cast so that you can't extend your knee and then say, okay, we're going to watch how quickly your leg muscles wither away since you literally can't use them now. Now that's very different from taking a week off of squatting, right? You're still walking around, you're getting out of bed, standing up out of chairs. So I wouldn't worry at all about muscle loss from a deload. Even 2 weeks completely off, you might start to lose a little bit, but you'll get it back very, very quickly. If you're doing anything at all, there's studies for pretty extended timelines where if people maintain intensity but do literally a ninth of their training volume, they can actually maintain their gains pretty well. So I would not give any thought to worries about muscle loss during a 1 week or even a 2 week deload. What do you think, Mike?
Yeah, I fully agree. In a lot of ways, I think the week off, even 2 weeks off, will do a person a lot of good. Mm-hmm. For strength, I know the question is about muscle, but for strength, you're most likely not going to lose anything. And there was one study from Wang, Hwang. I think I reviewed it in the first volume of Mass back in volume 1, so maybe 7 years ago. in which individuals took 2 weeks off of training, came back, and they were actually slightly stronger.
Yeah.
Now, whether that was outside kind of the measurement error in that case, I don't know, but they definitely didn't lose any strength. And in terms of muscle, you're going to be pretty resistant as well. I've only seen a handful, even less than that, just a very few studies in which muscle has been lost following maybe 2 weeks off. But if you go to some of the tapering literature, I would encourage people, the way I would encourage people to not worry so much about taking 1 week off, especially for muscle, is in the tapering literature, one of the tapering methods with some efficacy is called training cessation. And that's just as it sounds, which is taking a full week off. And over that time, individuals aren't losing any strength. They're typically not losing muscle over that 1 week or so. Now, 2 weeks, probably fine. After that, maybe a little bit. But as Trex said, even if you lose a very little bit of muscle, it's going to come back so quickly. A couple weeks back in the gym and you're good to go. So I just don't see it as a concern. And like Eric said, the way this came about was for, when actually the term deloading is used in some of those immobilization studies, right? And essentially, some of those are looking to kind of simulate a weightlessness condition, even for space travel, and to understand what goes on in microgravity. That's not the situation of somebody who's taken a week off from the gym, but is, walking around, living their life, not sitting in bed. You're good to go. So I wouldn't be concerned about that at all. Even if you were to lose just a very negligible amount of muscle, you probably wouldn't notice. Nobody would notice by looking at you, and you would gain it back almost immediately after being back in the gym for just a couple weeks. So it's not something that I would stress about. It would take a long time. And even if you took a month off, would you lose muscle? Probably. But would you gain it back very quickly? Yes, you would. So even in that case, if you're going on a trip, it's summer, family reunion, you got to go away for a couple weeks, for a month, you get married, you're going on your honeymoon, something like that. If you have time and you want to train, go for it. If you don't, my advice is don't. You're going to be fine when you come back. If you want to because it makes you feel good, go for it. But I wouldn't worry about that muscle loss over that short time frame. Now, you're out of training for 6 months, for a year. Okay, different story. But those short time frames, I don't think they're a big deal.
Yeah, definitely. And there's another question about deloads. And this one, I'm not super familiar with the literature on this, but I think you are, Mike. So the question is there any benefit to deloading for hypertrophy in order to kind of resensitize the muscles? So previously in this episode, you used the term volume cycling, like the idea that maybe you work up to high volumes and then take it back down and kind of resensitize to that effect of volume escalation. Where's the literature at when it comes to desensitization or resensitization to muscle growth? And where do deloads fit into that paradigm?
So in terms of how we are looking at it or thinking about it, I think the literature is in its infancy in terms of the volume cycling literature, specifically in terms of resensitization and desensitization to muscle growth. In terms of where it is following detraining and retraining, that's a different story. So let's start there. So going all the way back to a 1991 study from Starin et al., coincidentally just before the Cowboys won their first Super Bowl in that realm, which seems like a long way off for those in the great state of Texas right now.
Mm-hmm.
Starin et al. Found that after 30 weeks of detraining, when people came back and trained for 20 weeks of training, then 30 weeks of detraining, then they trained for 6 more weeks. So trained for 20 weeks, took 30 weeks off, then 6 weeks of retraining. And they were able to gain back nearly all of their strength and most of their muscle after being off for 30 weeks and coming back for only 6 weeks. So that's a pretty good regain there after only 6 weeks back to training. Another study from Cadi in 2004 had 90 days of training, then 90 days of detraining in men. And they lost a pretty decent amount of muscle, but it wasn't crazy. They were at an okay point to start training again. And based upon the results of Sterin, after not training for 30 weeks and then training for 6 weeks again, being able to regain quite rapidly. So specifically, if I can recall in that Sterin study, I think that individuals trained for 20 weeks, gained 60-ish%, right? They were more beginners, lost 13% strength when taking 30 weeks off, but then gained between 20 and 40% strength when training again for 6 weeks. So that's a pretty rapid regain in strength, and some muscle did go along with that. So I think it's impressive, the gains that we see in the literature when beginning to retrain, and they do come pretty rapidly. Now, in terms of the desensitization and resensitization to volume, in terms of volume cycling, I don't think there's a ton there at the moment, but I do think there's reason to believe it's promising. And I've talked about this on office hours before, which is that I've remembered, Eric, that I need to get the fireworks going again. So I'm here at the beginning. So I'm going back to the hands now. And so I was in Ricky Bobby mode for a while. Now I'm back. And so when we think about volume cycling, I think there's reason to believe that we have some hope here. So if we think of these really high volume studies, there's a study from Abe et al., a study from Schoenfeld et al., recent study from Ennis et al., Brigato going into 30, 40, 50 sets plus per week. These studies tend to show perhaps a relationship between up to 50 sets and more muscle growth than 30 sets or 20 sets or 10 sets per week. But I'd be willing to bet that that's not sustainable all the time.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I'm in opinion mode now, right? I'd be willing to bet that the volumes that are being done at those really high groups in those studies are a lot more than the volume somebody who's done previously. So it essentially amounts to 8, 10, 12 weeks of overreaching in that individual on that specific muscle group, right? These individuals aren't doing this on 15 different exercises, right? They're doing this counting in direct sets mostly, although the NS study was only direct sets on a specific muscle group. And so I think it's probably a more short-term overreaching block where we're seeing that growth. Then you're probably going to want to decrease volume, maybe to desensitize yourself to it. So in another training block, you can resensitize yourself to it, but also for practical reasons, that if you're doing 50 plus sets per week on chest, shoulders, and triceps, you're probably not also going to be able to maintain 50 plus sets per week on legs, back, and biceps. Those are probably going to be more at maintenance at, 10 sets per week muscle group or something like that. Then as the chest, shoulders, and triceps come down to more maintenance, then you can raise the legs, back, and biceps to maybe be more in that 30, 40, 50 set per week and so forth. And perhaps you're desensitizing the muscle groups you brought down at that point. It's difficult to say, but there is, I think, based upon that, those high volume studies, because I doubt it's sustainable over time, even if only for practical reasons of not being able to sustain that high volume year round, then I would suggest that there is some promise toward volume cycling. But in the literature, we do see, if I think back to that old Sterin study, I think back to that Cadi study, I do think there's pretty good evidence to be able to show that retraining works. I think there's also a study from Blažević in 2007, who is a really good muscle physiologist that's done a lot of work, especially on eccentric training and so forth, looking at 10 weeks of training and then detraining. And I think over the detraining period, after 10 weeks of training, and I think the detraining was 3 months, there was a pretty negligible decrease in muscle growth of the vastus lateralis. And so in short, I don't think you're risking too much muscle loss from taking some time off. I do think that you gain it back pretty quickly, the resensitization effect, if we want to call it that. And then how we would think of it in volume cycling, I think the data is in its infancy, but I think especially for practical reasons, volume cycling makes a lot of sense. And I'd like to see some research come out on it. Hopefully somebody's out there doing it.
Yeah, good stuff. I think kind of wrapping up this chatter about deloads, I would just want to add one additional, throw a couple more of my 2 cents in the mix here. So just from a practical perspective, there's a lot of questions about deloads, and I think deloads are interesting and they always generate good discussion, but sometimes I think folks tend to overthink it a little bit and maybe attribute more complexity than necessary with deloads. I can say that despite all the theory behind what deloads may or may not be good for, in practice, as a coach, usually with deloads, I implement them as needed. And a lot of my clients notice that I have them deload less than other coaches they've worked with. So for me, some coaches will do deloads every, 4th week, is a common approach. And there's nothing wrong with that inherently. You can do tremendous programming with that approach, no question. But I prefer to use deloads as needed, and I usually don't feel the need to use them until every maybe 6 to 10 weeks of training. With some clients, we end up going 12 or more weeks without a deload, just kind of pushing through, progressing. And I'm not going to ask them to slam on the brakes when they're making great progress week over week if I'm not seeing any need for a deload. Once I see that we have maybe a need for a deload, we take a week, and more often than not, I would say the norm for my clients is that they come back stronger, not weaker, from a deload, which for me is usually good feedback to indicate that, number one, we probably did need the deload, and number two, now that we're stronger after it, it looks like it did what it was supposed to do. So for me, that's kind of a really ideal situation, is at the first, when I'm first starting to see those clues, those indicators that a deload might be necessary, we go ahead and take it. We see that nice little surge, that rebound in performance. They come back refreshed, feeling more enthusiastic. If there is any kind of staleness developing in their just kind of general subjective, feeling with regards to training, that staleness usually gets cleared up. So deloads can be a really fantastic tool from a practical perspective. But if you want to play with them in your training and try to explore these other kind of more nuanced theoretical topics, like, incorporating it in a kind of volume cycling strategy, then more power to you. It's definitely a cool tool that can be used in training. And I think it's always good to encourage some of that experimentation. Let that experimentation be guided or influenced by the science that's available so far. But honestly, when it comes to deloads, not a tremendous amount of science yet. Some indirect stuff that you can glean insight from, but it's definitely an understudied area. Quick question from Artzilla in the chat here about alcohol. So they read on a website that alcohol consumption shuts down all metabolic pathways until the alcohol is out of your system, and that working through that alcohol can take up to 36 hours. Would that necessarily mean that fat loss is completely blunted for 36 hours? No. There's people like to write a lot of blog posts about alcohol, and don't, make no mistake about it. Alcohol or ethanol metabolism is fascinating. It's really cool. So it is true that, your body does like to burn through it and does like to kind of prioritize that metabolism when, and that's not unique to alcohol. I mean, human metabolism is regulated by like a zillion different inputs, and it's always shifting substrate utilization based on contextual demands, right? So if you're chilling at rest in a fasted state, you're mostly burning fat. Maybe if you're like not just fasting, but like literally starving, then maybe you're breaking down some protein and more ketones. If you're in a fasted state and then you drink, a super giant Coca-Cola full sugar, then guess what? Fat utilization goes down, carbohydrate utilization goes up. So this isn't some kind of foreign concept that ethanol enters your system and all of a sudden there's a change in substrate utilization. Of course you want to burn through that ethanol because out of all the macronutrients, ethanol is the only one that's like literally a poison at normal intake levels. So there's that. It makes sense that we want to go ahead and take care of that. And also, you can't store ethanol. You got to get rid of it, right? So it makes sense why our metabolic regulation would be tailored that way. The thing that's cool about ethanol metabolism, and please understand that I would discourage this in the strongest terms possible. But if you drink too much ethanol or too much alcohol in a short period of time, and you basically overload your capacity to actually metabolize it for energy, at a certain point of excessive intake, your body will just excrete it in an unmetabolized form. It'll just go in and go out. And you literally will not absorb the calories from that ethanol because it's just leaving. And we've all experienced this because, like, when you are near someone who, let's say, rare occasion, maybe you're at a wedding, it's 2 a.m, and you're next to someone who's had a little bit too much fun, and you say, yeah, I can literally smell the alcohol on you. I can smell it on your breath. They literally are excreting totally unmetabolized ethanol in that situation, which is a fascinating, just a really cool facet of ethanol metabolism is that, like, you literally will breathe it out of your lungs in an unmetabolized form and like sweat it out. So it's kind of cool. But all of that is to say, like, the effect of alcohol on fat burning, alcohol, if you're trying to be really lean, it's not doing you any favors directly because it's a really dense form of energy. So alcohol is 7 calories per gram. And usually alcoholic beverages also come with some carbohydrate that aren't really bringing you a lot of nutrients, right? So it's going to be usually some sugar or carbohydrate plus, energy dense alcohol. So it's not really doing you any favors for getting lean. But I think a lot of times the kind of nuanced perspectives on ethanol metabolism, making them seem, tremendously fattening in moderate intake levels, I think a lot of that stuff is overblown. And there's longitudinal trials where they basically have people drink 1 or 2 beers a day and then do a training program. And moderate alcohol in that kind of dosage, 1 or 2 drinks a day, doesn't really seem to impact body composition at all. So, of course, excessive alcohol drinking is bad for body composition in a number of different ways and is terrible for your health. Do not recommend it. And believe me, I enjoy a nice beer as much as anybody. I really enjoy beer quite a lot. But sometimes you want to mix in maybe a non-alcoholic beer like this one I got right here. And by the way, if you're looking for a good non-alcoholic beer, looking on the screen right now, it's Klostaler. Klostaler? I don't know how to pronounce that. My last name's German, but I haven't really picked up the language. But anyway, a great non-alcoholic beer. But yeah, excessive drinking, it's bad news for body composition and a lot of other things as well. Now, Mike, there's another question in here about caffeine. I think I'm going to try to hit that one, and that's probably going to do it for tonight, unless there's another one that you felt really strongly about answering.
No, I have a couple people I'll respond to here when you're done. But I was going to say we may be done unless you have any other sponsors that aren't actually sponsors that you'd like to promote.
Well, actually, now that you bring it up, someone did ask me about some books on my bookshelf, what's cooking on the bookshelf back there. And I figured now would be a good time to plug those. These publishers can become sponsors if they like. So Eduardo was asking about the books on my shelf. I just picked a couple ones that I really like and would recommend. So first one, Zen and the Art of Saving the Planet by Thich Nhat Hanh. I think it's been about a year since Thich passed away, but this is a really fantastic book. Highly recommend it. Thich Nhat Hanh was a Zen Buddhist monk, world-renowned for being a tremendous teacher and a really great writer. Makes things very accessible. And if you're worried that it's going to convert you to a different religion, I think that Vietnamese Zen, the type of Buddhism that Thich Nhat Hanh teaches, it's very non-religious in nature. So, if you already practice a religion and you're worried about kind of introducing new ideas that might make you a little uncomfortable, this isn't the kind of thing that's going to, convert you or make you question your faith. It's a very, very secular approach, I would say, to Buddhist philosophy and thought. Another one by Karma Yeshe Rabgye. He is also a Buddhist monk. This one's called The Best Way to Catch a Snake. Really nice guide to like the fundamentals of Buddhism if you're into that kind of thing. Now, Karma Yeshe Rabgye is a Tibetan Buddhist monk. He's in the Tibetan school, which has a little bit more of a religious element to it. So if that makes you uncomfortable, then that might not be the one to pick up. But I think he does a great job. And his podcast actually is called Buddhism Guide on Spotify. Really good podcast that is taught in a very secular way as well. And then finally, Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. I was getting really into Buddhism, and I found that Stoicism complements it really quite nicely. So I've been reading a little bit more Stoicism stuff lately. And then I've been really getting into Taoism, and I've been getting into it so much. I've been reading Tao Te Ching on and off. It's a very short book, but you can just kind of pick it up and jump to a page and start reading. It's kind of written that way. It's not like a long narrative where you have to go start to finish. And that book is so high on my list that it has left the bookshelf, Mike, and has been promoted to the coffee table. Oh, so it's always within reach out there.
On your coffee table, do you have, famously was written a coffee table book about coffee tables?
I don't have that one, but I wish I did. And of course, I as a person who, I don't really have that many family traditions other than Seinfeld. So the alluding to that book is not lost on me, but unfortunately, none of our books have little novelty legs that pop out so that the book can function as a table.
It's a great idea. It's amazing it didn't catch on.
It is. It really is. Okay, so here's the last thing I wanted to address. So Daniel said, please don't tell us coffee is bad. I heard that's going to be your next lit review. And there was a question here that said, do we know the minimum amount of caffeine reduction that's needed to resensitize ourselves to its effects? So we're pretty much running up on time here. We've been going for about an hour and a half, and Mike and I both wake up at 4 a.m. every day, so we need to get to bed. But I will say the cover story for the next issue of Mass is going to be all about caffeine. It is going to be, even if you're not a Mass subscriber, the cover story every month, it's kind of our charitable donation to the world. We make it publicly accessible. So if you can hear the sound of my voice, you're going to be able to see that article. But it's called The Pros and Cons of Caffeine. And I've written in Mass thousands of times about all of the upsides of caffeine. And this is the first time that I've felt compelled to write about some of the drawbacks of caffeine. Now, it's not an article that says caffeine or coffee is bad and you shouldn't have it and your life is going to totally change once you ditch it. But I'm reviewing a new article that looked at the effects of caffeine intake versus caffeine abstention. And it was in a really cool design where over the course of 14 days, the researchers would just kind of randomly, using a kind of algorithm that randomized it effectively, tell people you're either going to have coffee today or you're going to abstain from caffeine completely. And they looked at a variety of different outcomes, and the short version of the findings was really fascinating because they found that caffeine, on the bright side, folks on caffeine days got more daily steps. So it looked like it had a kind of indirect effect by which it increased physical activity, increased step counts, which is great. That's a fantastic thing. The downside was that for most people on average, it did significantly reduce the amount of sleep that they got each night. And if you've been reading Mass for a while, you know that the last time I talked about timing of caffeine before sleep, back in the day, people said, drink as much as you want, just stop 6 hours before bed. There's never really good evidence to support that claim. And the newest evidence seems to indicate that if you're going to have a large dose of caffeine, upwards of, 200, 250 milligrams cumulative throughout the day, you probably want to drink all of that at least like 13 hours before bed. And a lot of folks hear that and they say, well, wait a minute, that doesn't really fit the way I normally drink caffeine. And so in this study, they didn't restrict when folks were supposed to have their caffeine. And it looks like most people left to their own devices on the days they consume caffeine, it does reduce the amount of sleep that they get, which certainly is not favorable from my perspective. They also found that caffeine consumption led to an increased frequency of a benign heart arrhythmia, right? So it did interfere with cardiac patterns and did increase the prevalence or the occurrence of a particular heart arrhythmia. That sounds worse than it is. It's not like there were a bunch of severe cardiac events in this study. But it does kind of help contextualize, every now and then, Mike, I'm sure you've seen these studies where there's a headline that says, this, so-and-so, a teenager, drank 2 energy drinks and had a heart attack or died. And of course, it's always tragic. But a lot of times you'll see those and you'll say, well, what do you mean? Because like I've had 2 energy drinks before and then some and been fine, right? And so in my article, I try to explain why these doses of caffeine that are high but not astronomically high, in the right context, as they increase the frequencies of these arrhythmias that normally aren't a big deal, if you layer that with someone who has an underlying heart condition that they may or may not know about, then you can actually see some instances where those heart arrhythmias that would typically be benign actually do become quite problematic and sometimes catastrophic. But in my article, I talk all about the different pros and cons of caffeine. I don't say necessarily whether you should or should not use it, but I do talk about the health side, the just general wellness side, and then also the performance side. So that brings me to the question about resensitization. We really don't know as much as we would like to know about sensitization, desensitization, resensitization when it comes to caffeine and performance. We do know that people who are habitual coffee drinkers, if we put them in a study exploring the acute effect of caffeine, they do have an ergogenic effect from caffeine. So regular caffeine consumers do get a performance benefit. But one thing that I would add to that is that we don't really have great evidence about how caffeine withdrawal affects performance and what that timeline actually looks like. So there are some study designs where people say, oh, look, our normal coffee drinkers, they got it in an ergogenic effect from caffeine. Clearly, they weren't desensitized to it. Well, it's also possible in some of these designs that when folks were doing their baseline testing, they were just performing very poorly because they were having caffeine withdrawal. And therefore, the ergogenic of caffeine theoretically could just be blocking or covering up the negative effects of caffeine withdrawal, right? So that's something that's kind of hard to tease out in some of these studies. And one of the only studies I can think of that actually repeatedly looked at the ergogenic effect of caffeine over time for a number of weeks. We had a review of it in Mass years ago, and they did find some evidence indicating that over a course of 20 days of caffeine consumption, the effect size was getting a little bit smaller as time went on. So that's definitely an open area of exploration. We don't really know much about desensitization of ergogenic effects and then resensitization. There's some evidence indicating that perhaps there is some desensitization, but to resensitize, we really don't have a good prescription other than if you stop taking it entirely for 2 weeks, I feel very strongly that you would be resensitized. But other than that, I don't think I can really provide much of a specific kind of timeline or guideline for resensitization. But anyway, that article is pretty in-depth. And like I said, it talks about performance perspectives. It talks about health and wellness. And I also share an anecdote. It's been coming up on, I think, 2 months now that I actually have not been consuming any caffeine. And I normally would consume 400, 500, 600 milligrams of caffeine a day. I was a big coffee drinker. I still love coffee. I just drink decaf every day. But in my article, I kind of reflect on what I've learned being someone who's drank coffee consistently since I was it's been, over a decade of being a habitual, nonstop, high-dose caffeine consumer. And going off caffeine for 2 months has been really eye-opening. There's a lot of insights and observations that I wouldn't have expected. So I definitely encourage people to check out that article. And with that out of the way, Mike, you mentioned you had a couple of things you wanted to say, and then we're going to wrap it up.
Just hi to those checking in that are always here. Hi to everybody, but I know Tina's checking in again. Philip is checking in again. S. Kelly, no questions this week, but I know they've been back. Thanks to them for checking in. And then had a comment here. See if I can find it. I just had it up. It seems to have disappeared. There it is. From Steven said that I used to have a video squatting in a storage unit squat rack while raining, and he thinks about that sometimes when he's lazy and needs to get it together. That is correct. That's the storage strength, the 24-hour storage strength fitness center. And if anybody's wondering what that is, that was 11 years ago now where Jordan Burke and I, a good friend of mine, we were on the powerlifting team together at Florida State. He was the 165-pound weight class open national champion at USAPL Nationals 2012, and he is the CEO of Rep One. And we're good friends, and we rented a storage unit, and we put an old squat rack I had in that storage unit, and we trained there. It was very small. I remember we got down to South Florida. We moved down here at the same time, and I hadn't started working my position at FAU yet. It was in the summer. And we were training for Raw Nationals that year that he ended up winning. And we went to LA Fitness like the first day we got down here. And I literally had this squat rack in the back of my truck with no place to put it. We went in the gym. All the bars were bent. They were terrible. And I threw a hissy fit in the middle of the gym. I was like, we're getting out of here. I was like, we're renting a storage unit. We rented the storage unit. We trained there all summer. It was awesome. And then I remember the video he's referring to, there was a hurricane here in South Florida. And, I wasn't married. I didn't have kids at the time. And so I didn't really care. And I was just training.
Yeah, you had nothing to live for.
It didn't matter.
It's basically what you're saying.
Yeah. I had no regard for anything. And I was just training in like the Category 3 hurricane in the storage unit by myself. Jordan was not there. I think he was in a climate controlled gym at that point.
Don't you just long for the days where no one cared if you lived or died?
Nobody cared. Nobody knew. The door was like half closed because it was so windy and I had no business being in there. But hey, had to lift, had to train, and that was my life at that point. But yeah, rented that storage unit, so we were co-owners. Sometimes people would park in our warm-up room. They called it the parking lot. I called it the warm-up room. It was kind of inconsiderate of them, but we trained there anyways. Little story to close us out.
Yeah, when I was in college, I was in the same place. No one cared if I lived or died. It would be fine. So I for whatever reason, there's this gym in a basement of a dorm. And I don't think anyone at the university knew it existed anymore because there was just no use for it. It was just this gym sitting there with like barbells and plates and stuff. Like it was pretty good. And so I heard about it through the grapevine and I was like, you got to be kidding me. So one day I went in there at 2 a.m. and just felt like getting a weight session in. I'm training alone and I got 315 on the bar benching and I got pancaked. I was in the basement at 2 a.m. and I was like, I'm not sure what I'm going to do here. And it was one of those things where, you hear about some mom whose kid is trapped under a car and the mom just picks up the car, and who knows the validity of those various stories. But man, I had a surge of strength that I've never experienced since. And it was weird. I got pancaked and then panicked and then pressed it as if it was nothing at all. And then I racked it and said, maybe dumbbells from now on, when it's 2 a.m. alone in a basement. Yeah.
No, so good, man.
Those were the days, man. But by the time I was done with college there, someone heard that this gym still existed and they shut it down. They got all the equipment out of there. They probably were like, we cannot believe that we haven't lost a tremendous lawsuit yet with this thing sitting down here. But those were the days, man. You could just lift in any old basement or storage unit, and that was how it worked.
They were just, public storage, rent the smallest one that barely fits the squat rack and get one. I don't even think, no, I had one mat that I would deadlift on, like a rubber mat, like 3/4 inch thick mat. And off we were. Hey, listen, I think I finished third at Raw Nationals that year and Jordan won. So
there's not a lot of gyms that can say 100% of their clients or members get top 3 at nationals.
That's true. Now, different time. I want to be clear on this. I think I would finish about 147th nowadays.
Yeah.
If I went in with the same numbers I had back then. So I don't want to sound like this is impressive, but that's right. 100% of our members. And, listen, it was tough to get a membership. Nobody else was able to pass our physical battery of tests. And maze and puzzles to become a member of the gym. And we weren't profitable, but it was good for the 2 members that existed.
Yeah, I would just love to train in a tiny storage unit in August in South Florida. That'd be terrific.
I train in my garage, here at my house now. And now that I'm running, I'm running distance in Florida, in the summers. And, you mentioned earlier, wake up at 4 a.m. One of the reasons I do that is so I can train at 4 a.m. because it is so hot here.
Yeah.
You're otherwise you're training in 95 degrees, near 100% humidity later in the day. And it's just unbearable. Even early in the morning, it's hot. But yeah, people say, oh, I want to move to South Florida for the weather. I'm not a big fan of the weather. I like the weather for about 2 months. Other than that, it's not, in my opinion, it's not great. It's very hot.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to be in Orlando, Florida, next week. So if any folks are around Orlando, at UCF, I'm giving a lecture about metabolic adaptation and exercise energy compensation. There's a cool event they do at the University of Central Florida in Orlando every year around this time. I'm going to be talking there. The good Dr. Jake Moda from Texas Tech is going to be talking there. Adam Gonzalez is going to be talking there. It's going to be a really cool event. So if you're in the Orlando area, stop by, say hi. It'd be great to see you. All right, Mike, I think that does it for tonight's episode. People got to get to bed, most importantly, us. If you are listening to this on the Iron Culture YouTube page or the Iron Culture podcast platforms, hope you liked it. This is Mass Office Hours. We do it every Wednesday night, and then we get it up on our platforms a few days after that. Stick around. Catch a few episodes in the future. Get caught up on our catalog. This is episode number 20. You can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts. You can find us on YouTube at Mass Research Review. And check us out on Instagram as well, at Mass Research Review. Hope you liked it. Like, share, review, all that stuff. And we hope to see you soon at another episode of Mass Office Hours.